It was the day before Shell, and lunch was becoming a more crowded affair. Since Melondi's secret had come out, the girls had taken to favouring a mid-sized table that seated 12, a sensible number. A small affair no more than 20 feet long, the table was well situated, away from the centre of the floor and off to one side. That had been useful, as the layout of the cafeteria put the table near the kitchen freezer. There was an awkward chill in that corner of the room which made it unpopular, and without other students about, the table offered relative privacy. Of course, 12 was ideal, as it conformed to the needs of their class. The girls of the practical humanity class had faced more than their share of scrutiny since the term began, and privacy had become a cherished commodity. Whether it was from curious girls wanting to know what the human was like, to its current, more immediate needs, the isolation of the spot had made the table a welcome retreat. That said, today it was getting a bit crowded, and with everyone there, an additional 3 seats had been needed, with girls shoving in from the sides. Kellark's attachment to Gumbri, or more accurately, Bree's attachment to Lark, has started things, of course. There was usually room for one more, certainly if one of the girls was off somewhere else and missing lunch. Since Melondi's secret had become a shared one, the table had become a place where Mel could, on occasion, talk less circumspectly. While she never slipped up otherwise, she could relax and enjoy her friends, without being quite so guarded. Things had been different before, when Bree hadn't been cleared by Agent Davari. Melondi had never resented Bree as an intrusion, but it was a fact of life that she hadn't noticed before. The ability to talk with her friends, even in the most circumspect way, had replaced her utter secrecy, or worse, the crafted lies about her history. When Bree joined them for lunch, Melondi had to go back into hiding, and Bree's presence brought with her a visceral feeling of the loss. When Zinshiki arrived, the 12 and sometimes 13 turned to 13 and sometimes 14. The pestering girl's presence was unmistakable. Zinshiki was different. It wasn't only the matter of her being alien, another species entirely, with her own loyalties and agenda. It was more that Zinshiki kept her own counsel, and while Melondi knew how to read people, even people from other races, the pestering girl was largely a closed book. It wasn't something she was used to. She was good with reading people, no matter the species. Generally. That carrion incident with the Rakiri delegate could have happened to anybody. Of course, while it wasn't always a full table, 14 was manageable. Today, there were 15 people crowding in for lunch, which was pushing it. Not that Prindi Amandis was unwelcome. The IOTC girl was another friend of Lark's by way of the Campus vlog. Thankfully, the question of who knew her secret had largely been settled, both by her request and the actions of her handler, Agent Davari. Now her friends knew, which was a greater relief than she'd imagined it could be. Professor Warwick knew, and he'd been allowed to tell Professor Pelavon. He was holding off until they were back from the honeymoon. It was an odd term for the usual getaway after a wedding, and he'd explained it as something to do with newlywed couples slipping away for a month and drinking a lot of something called mead. Melondi figured she should have a word of quiet thanks to Professor Pelavon for taking up so much of Professor Warwick's time, but it would wait until they were back. Gumbri had been oddly muted after finding out. While Bree was the Baroness's daughter, Agent Davari had opted to lay things out to her in private, as she had an abiding interest in the news. That probably meant several threats behind closed doors, a reading of General Order 24, and signing waivers that didn't mention words like frozen tundra. They didn't need to. Davari tended to make herself clear enough. It was hard to believe the same bubbly music professor could be so frigid as an agent, but Davari had no problems with being convincing. Melondi looked over at Lark and pursed her lips thoughtfully. I still need to make things up to her. I don't know if clearing Bree counts. That left the IOTC girls, and as she looked up the table at Prindi, it was hard to believe the world she crafted here at the Academy had changed so dramatically. As Lark's friend, Prindy made an easy liaison with the IOTC girls. Even so, it was tight with her here, and if more of them showed up, something would have to give. She planned to tell her friends, someday, after graduation, when she was off on her own. She'd hoped that some of them might still be in reach, and understanding. They'd all be off starting their own lives, working in their house companies, starting careers, or managing the family holdings. Everyone would go their different ways. But her sister Calandria's death had changed everything. She could enjoy her friends now instead of later, wondering if they would still be hers when she revealed herself as a princess. It was a bright note in a dark situation, and she cherished it for what it was. She had friends, real friends, that had come to know her outside of the palace, without any agendas, and she had the time, over 2 more years, before adult life sent them off on their own paths. At least if I live that long. That was a gloomy thought, and it was hard to hold on to it. She'd only just hung up on a call from Vadim. Whenever she talked to him, the future didn't seem so dark. He'd accepted her for who and what she was as a person, and then he'd done it all over again for who and what she was as a princess. Screw Camordry. I want to live. That was Vadim. He says they're putting up a sign and closing the restaurant for a week to celebrate the birth of a boy in the family. Everything's ready to start the training tomorrow at 9. She raised her voice over the animated conversations going on. It was lunch, after all, and with all the jockeying of plates and trays and dishes and whatnot, it was a scramble. If any more girls showed up from the IOTC, they'd have to do something, or at least get a round table. No one could reach anything. Prindy, can you let your cadre know? It was bad timing, since the girl just took a bite, but she nodded quickly, chewing frantically. Just take it easy. Mel looked around past the table with an exaggerated glance. The nod's all I need, and you're like Vadim. Hands off, though. As a young girl, she never expected that she'd need to warn anyone away from her boyfriend. When she finally got one, no one would dare. Just now? If all of this felt new to her, it must be like a bucket of icy surf landing on the IOTC girls. And Vadim was hers. Prindy finally cleared her throat and nodded again. Yes, Melondi, she offered helpfully. While the IOTC girl had been giving her curious looks now and then, she tried her best to hide them. She still looked like she was struggling. Remember, it's just Melondi. Yes. The idea of calling a princess something informal, looking like it was sticking in the girl's throat, and she took a way out. I'll let them know after lunch. Thank you, Mel called back. It was something Mother had always insisted on, and Lady Wakama had taught her well. Good manners were for everyone. It had even seen her through that carrying incident, though she hadn't even been 5 at the time. Come to think of it, it was Camordry who helped me out, and was laughing the loudest. She felt an ugly blush start to rise, but it faded just as quickly. She'd never known her elder sister except as a distant figure, not a part of her life, really. Even without the attempt on her life, it had grown a lot easier in the last few months not to care for Camordry at all. The table didn't take much notice. Jax was in an animated conversation with Nesfa about business, while the twins were actually giggling about something. Most of the talk had been about class, though Belder was getting a lot of ribbing and good-natured jokes from the others. Tonight was the big night, after all. Even Zenshiki was quietly talking to Desi about the weekend. As the outsider, Prindy seemed to be struggling to fit in, though she hid it well. I'm glad you could join us, Prindy, Melondi offered brightly, trying to keep the girl from feeling too isolated. I know we sort of keep to ourselves. There was a lot of attention after we got into Professor Warwick's class. It was a little rough after registration, and you wouldn't believe some of the questions we got after he did the Marriage Fundamentals seminar. That was rough, Sevin nodded. I had one girl ask me if he had any boys in his family, and when they'd be coming. That was pretty embarrassing. Embarrassing? Prindy blinked doubtfully. as she reoriented on Sephir. At 6'11", it seemed impossible to miss the girl. Sephir was a star of the Academy diving team, with muscles like titanium cables, but she was so polite and unassuming that it often came as a surprise when she spoke up in conversation. She'd been a lot happier since her future in her house had been sorted, though, and at the moment she was grinning cheerfully at the bewildered look on Prindy's face. Prindy cocked her head uncertainly. "How is it embarrassing?" "Oh, it's just... his wife and his daughter were killed when the Imperium landed on Earth." Belder winced, but still looked relieved at no longer being the center of attention. At least she'd finally stopped blushing. "Professor Pelavon asked us not to talk about it at first," says Sephir with a nod. Even if she looked like a recruiting poster for the Marines, she was a caregiver at heart, and had always shied away from talking about what Warwick called the landings. "Professor Warwick, well, you can tell it still hurts him." "Yeah," Nestor chipped in. "He's smart, and a lot tougher than you'd expect. You just can't think of him as a male." "Human male," Desi broke off her conversation with Zinchiki. "There's a whole lot going on with him that even the rest of you don't see. He and I talk a lot at the museum." "Is it true he adopted both of you?" Prindy asked, looking from Desi to Zinchiki and back. Melondi forgotten for the first time. "We all heard things, and there were a lot of questions after the wedding. I mean, like the dancers. Where did they even come from?" "Yes, it's true. Both of us." Desi broke in abruptly, interrupting Prindy's train of thought, and Mel started breathing again. If word got out about the tide pool, it would probably need more than a general order and a very angry interior agent to keep quiet. Desi was nodding frantically, as she enthusiastically changed the subject. "We don't talk about the wedding, but it's true. It became official when Professor Pelavon married him. They're my mothers and father now." "Wow, that's..." Prindy's brows knitted a bit as she struggled with the whole wedding. Sure, the whole school had seen it, but the response had been more of a collective silence from around the table. Prindy took the hint and offered a smile. "So, what do you talk about then? I mean, if not the wedding, what about the war sim? The rest of the cadre couldn't believe it. I hope we weren't whispering too loud. Most of us were glued to our omnipads, gossiping on our Discuss channel. Everybody wants to know more. I can't wait to go through these files." "We don't talk about the war sim. We have team meetings, but aside from those, we don't. There's a lot of extra credit on the line," Desala said firmly, giving her a solid nod. "None of us know what's on those files, though we had an exchange professor that... well, I don't think she understood the material." "Careful, Desala. You're in danger of being kind," Pris muttered, though there wasn't any heat in it. Desala sniffed but said nothing. Pris pressed on, waving her fork full of pickled jawar like a baton. "She's right, though. None of us know what's in the files, and we probably shouldn't. Professor Warwick uses this method of teaching. It's sort of like discovering the material a bit at a time, and figuring it out as we go." "That sounds really odd." Prindy was canting her head fully now, and Mel could just imagine what the girl was thinking. It had been an adjustment. The IOTC girl looked back at Desi. "Sorry, it just does." "You don't have to convince me." Desi nodded sympathetically, wearing an easy smile. "Once you get used to Muppets and Furbies." "Oh, and Alf!" Jacksme broke in, laughing. "And his music, though that's really good," offered one of the twins, as the other nodded. "And we get free movies. Things that haven't made it here from Earth yet." "It's a lot, but after a while nothing phases you." Desi grinned infectiously. "Oh, Mel, do we know if Arku is going to make it to, the event?" "I'll have to ask." Melondi shook herself out of the reverie of listening. "I know the invitation is getting sent. We can find out tomorrow." "Oh, right." Desi nodded, but looked back at her plate, subdued. No one knew they were going to the palace tomorrow except Agent Davari, who was going to escort them, and Desi was still looking pretty shy about the prospect. Still, everybody else had practice at human food. There was something we're all kind of curious about from the sim. I mean, it's not to do with the sim. Prindy bit her lip, looking around as the table went suddenly quiet. We all knew about Earth. I mean, he's human. Not about his family, but things. Anyway, some of us were wondering, and now I guess I really am, why doesn't he hate us like we're some sort of enemy? There are stories, you know. Desi? One of the twins looked over at her seriously, setting aside whatever they'd been laughing about. Her sister sniffed, a beat behind. You know him best. Well, obviously he doesn't. Hate us, I mean. I think he really means it about the Imperium making human citizens. Something he said once kind of stuck with me. Desi grimaced in thought. He said he didn't think of the Imperium as his enemy, because the enemy is someone that tells you to hate that which is different from you, because sooner or later that hate comes back to you. And he said the Imperium hasn't done that. We have kind of messed up there. Jacksmy sighed unhappily. I mean, all the news I get back from my family on Earth is great. I had the best letter from my uncle, but my mother's told me stories. Some of the houses first gifted with business grants on Earth abused them pretty badly. Not a lot, but the ones that did, well, it wasn't just one mess. A couple of the houses got really carried away, and it took a while to sort out. That sounds like a job for the interior. The Imperium doesn't tolerate, that is... Prindy sat a little taller, and her eyes shone with conviction before she stuttered to a halt, blushing as she glanced back to Melondi. We're supposed to stop that sort of thing. Mel watched as an awkward silence fell around the table, broken only by Zenshiki slicing away bits of her Turox, with another of her occasional mutters of, eek. It wasn't like she could entirely blame them. The Empire needed the interior. There were the boisterous and splashy ones, like House Rocher. There were the quietly dutiful ones, like Belder's House Asana, and the pharmacological company run by Cephis House. There were the quietly powerful ones in the background, like House Chelksa, all of them working at what they did best. But sometimes there were incidents. Bad matrons who lost control of their ambitions. The Empire was vast, and when the houses couldn't police themselves, it was time for the Empress to do it. That's where the interior came in. Mother had been working to rein the interior in, over time, to bring it back to its core mission. She didn't talk about it very much, but growing up she'd seen it happen. She could still remember the rumblings in court when she named Opimea Potak and a Dixie to run the Ministry of Justice. People had said things around a 6-year-old they didn't think would be understood, or remembered, even by a 6-year-old princess. As for her cousin Indara and Prince Adam, it had taken time, but Mother had gotten things under control. If only she were here now, but she isn't. I have to handle this myself. That meant she needed the interior. Someday. Right now she needed these cadets. Glancing down the table, Desi caught her eye and suddenly snorted. Seriously, Zenshiki? What is it with ick all the time? You were ready to eat my father alive only a month ago. Now you turn your nose up at anything sweet or fatty? When did you turn into a picky eater, for goddess's sake? You do not understand. Food is plentiful here. That is understood. The dusky Pezrin set aside her cutlery and eyed Desi coolly. You have never seen a fat Pezrin. No. Desi rocked her head to one side, in exasperation. Zenshiki had a way of making statements out of questions. But I'd never seen a Pezrin at all until we met you. What's that got to do with it? Shill and its worlds live without scarcity. Pesh does not. You will never see a fat Pezrin. Zenshiki replied coolly, blinking at Desi once. Melondi couldn't decide if the Pezrin girl was exasperated or amused without seeing her tail, her Asaiak. It was hidden under the table, but it seemed like it conveyed a lot of Pezrin body language. Or maybe it was just Zenshiki. Wasting food when it is plentiful is as much of a sin as wasting food when it is scarce. I suppose, Desi chewed over the idea while the rest of the girls thought it over.
Besides, I have my figure to consider. Hey, that's true. I've been worried about everything for tonight.
Belder grinned suddenly.
So, are there any cute pestering guys around?
Perhaps, though I would not impress him if I was slow and fat.
Mel thought over the reply. The pause was longer than the pestering girl usually took to answer, and she wasn't blinking. Sooner or later she'd figure her out. For the moment, she watched as Inshiki picked up her knife and fork, and cut away another bit of Turox with particular deliberation.
Ick. So, you girls get free movies too?
Prindy asked the twins, looking between the pair tentatively.
Stuff that hasn't come out yet? What's that like? A lot, yes. The Ministry of Relations closed down on a lot of entertainment from Earth. It's opening back up, but Professor Warwick has a lot of things no one has seen.
Offered one of the Kerbal sisters. Her twin nodded in sync.
Even with things opening up, they're still screening for, treason?
Prindy nodded understandingly.
Porn,
the twins said in unison, giggling.
Not that we mind. You could ask Belder for all the details. She's seen Liam with his shirt off.
Goddess damn it!
Belder started turning blue all over again.
It was only almost off. Almost! We could put off movie night until tomorrow. We can bring food back after training in the morning. Take over the room, have a movie marathon and celebrate.
Pris spoke up.
That way Belder can watch too. Hey, could you? Belder grinned. That would be great.
Sure, and that way we get to drag all the juicy details out of you too.
Pris smiled back serenely. Melondi watched as Belder started blushing again, and muttered as the others laughed. Goddess love her, Belder was such a farm girl.
What kind of movies?
Prindy asked, brushing her hair back.
Could I come?
This is going to sound odd, but I kind of miss driving, Tom said, leaning back in his seat between Miv and Leia. It was a comfortable way to ride, and the company was the best. Even with an alien landscape speeding by, it was the oddest feeling. Until he'd come to Shill, he'd always been the one doing the driving. Autocabs were quick and efficient, and other than his regular trip out to Human Food, it wasn't like he knew where things were on Shill. But it felt odd.
You don't have a license?
Miv tousled his hair, looking at him indulgently, while Leia curled in tight on the other side. She was happy as a clam they were all together, but she cocked her head, looking at Miv.
It's only a few weeks of study, if you want to get one.
Nah, it was just a stray thought. I'm good with being able to pay attention to you two, and it's nice actually seeing the world go by. He pulled them both closer, which Miv enjoyed, and made Leia squeak in pleasure. Leia had been a real princess about the lack of attention, and she loved sharing with Miv, but with her work out in Kree and Tori, what could you do? He smiled and leaned in, kissing her lightly on the neck. This weekend would be all about making it up to them both. Speaking of which, they were just about there. The drive had given him ample time to cuddle up with Miv and Leia, which had been a lot of fun, but also just the distraction he'd needed. He tossed a jacket over the seat back, showing the map display, but as the auto cab turned into their destination, there was nothing for it.
Miv, what's this?
Leia was the first to notice, and she stared out the window as the cab turned in. Jets of brightly lit water began fountaining up on either side of the cab, as it made its way up the long drive, the highway quickly out of sight. Mivert pulled his coat off the seat to peer at the map, and frowned in consternation as he looked at the display.
This is all wrong.
Actually, no it isn't, Tom grinned, pulling her back. We're exactly where we need to be.
But Tom, this isn't our hotel.
Miv stared at him blankly.
Oh, love, you must have put the directions in wrong.
I cancelled us there. Ladies, remember when you were going to take me on a holiday for the weekend? The one we missed thanks to my unscheduled trip to the hospital? He grinned, enjoying their confusion. Leia was still looking out the window as the view turned from impressive to luxurious, and was quickly heading for opulent. When I was in recovery, I asked Prince Adam for 3 favors. Pushing through Dessa's adoption was one, looking into a Leia was another, and a weekend somewhere nice to make it up to you both was number 3. Tom Drew moved back into the seat beside him, and slipped his arm back around Leia as she pressed to the window, the drive opening out on the broad vista in the hotel beyond. Ladies, welcome to the Imperial Ocean Reserve. Following at a covert distance, and it has still been an easy drive. With an hour or 2 left to go, Sergeant Jelk had done the driving, leaving Captain Solani to do the sensible thing and get some sleep. Honestly, it was kind of a relief. The captain had been keyed up over Warwick, and after finally getting out of the bunker, it was nice not to make small talk. Thank the goddess the woman was sensible, but even so, she still had it bad. At least I haven't had to make small talk along the... Wait a minute. Jelk frowned as the autocab turned in off the highway and pulled slowly onto the median. There was no doubt about it. The cab had diverted off the drive and was heading out of sight into... Well, fuck me. Being a Death's commando meant being down in the blood and the mud, deployed to some of the worst situations known to women. But every so often, it also put you in the way of protecting the great and the powerful. Jelk knew big money when she saw it. Captain, you need to wake up. Jelk pulled to a stop on the shoulder of the road. I think we have a problem. It was early afternoon when Aku closed the file on his omnipad. The end of his tour had passed. He'd survived, at least on the outside. It wouldn't do to look anything less than your best, after all. On the inside was another matter. His mistress, the cliff singer Tranja, had torn apart his every performance from the time he stepped on stage until the final note. Nothing was right. Nothing was good enough. While she hadn't said he was an embarrassment as an initiate, she hadn't needed to. The words had hung in the air, tangible if unspoken. This was his life. Sitting in the dark at the Enclave's library, he thought about the tour. It had been an abject misery. If not for Kazlan and Kamara, he'd probably have lost his mind under the pressure. If only things were different. I could be a regular guy. Maybe I could have met them instead, or someone like them. Started a family and lived a normal life. His eyes crept back to his omnipad. As miserable as he was at that moment, he knew he was telling himself a lie. Even if it had all been different, there was still the music. It burned inside, begging to be let out, and he yearned to make it happen. Even though his mistress seemed determined to sink his hopes into the deeps, there was still the music. It could not be denied. He kept away from the other initiates after returning to the Enclave. They were his competition. He couldn't see them as anything else now, but inside it felt like a losing battle. Only one of them would inherit their mistress's position and title, and it didn't seem likely that it would be him. In desperation, he turned to the archives. Cliff singing was old. It was respected. Revered. Generations upon generations of singers had practiced their art, handing down their names. Over time, the art had become codified. The singers had become living treasures, but the original works survived. Every generation had added something of their own. He delved deep into the stacks, diving through the recordings, searching the early works. There were files and archives and even printed records. He'd torn through all of them, not knowing what he was looking for until he'd found it. The song was old, ancient even, and written by one of the singers whose name had not become selected as the final 12 of Shill. The music was haunting, and it burned with a vibrancy that he didn't see in the more modern works, the kind of things that are often in demand now. There was almost no music. The singer's voice rang out alone, echoing off the cliffs accompanied only by a single steel arekia. But the song spoke to him. The language was stilted with age, but as he translated it into more modern terms, it felt comfortable. It had the yearning that he felt inside, and which almost seemed human in its power as he transcribed and updated it for his presentation. It was traditional. It was very traditional. If he was going to reclaim his mistress's approval, this was what he needed. He'd give his performance tonight, in front of his mistress and the others. Show them he was good enough. Show her that he was better than the rest. The music called, and he had to answer. Aku sighed again, wondering what the twins were doing at school right now. It had to be better than here.
You are being such a bitch, Kazan said hotly, scowling over the table at Desala.
Kamara scowled over at the girl before joining in.
She's right. There's no call for this kind of behavior.
You two brought it on yourselves. Desala crossed her arms defiantly, while Desi slumped to the chair, resting her head on one fist and steadfastly refused to join in.
What are you talking about? You're twisting our arms, and you're sucking up to Jaxme.
Kazlin was on her feet now, pointing at Desala, and Kazlin rose in defense. There wasn't much more she could add to that.
I don't suck up to anyone,
Desala snapped coldly, though Jaxme sat back, preening. It was the first happy look on the Choksa girl's face, as she'd been left desperately trying to keep the Japanese out of some city called Mecca.
You two brought it on yourselves, sucking up to England with that marriage proposal. You didn't want to join in, so this is what you get for coming late. There's nothing to get.
Kazlin swept a hand up at the map on the screen.
They've completely swept everything out of Africa.
Well, that's what you get for joining late. Anything you want to take, you can take out of France, Desala said with a finality. Isn't that right, Lark? Kerlark was looking at her omnipad unhappily, saying nothing. Desala turned to look at her this time.
Lark? It's fine. Really,
Lark said unhappily. What? Desala started to frown, and Desi sat up, taking notice. What's fine?
Well, I didn't want to tell you this, but I think the Czechs are going to declare independence and revolt.
Kazlin closed her eyes and settled back in her chair. The casualties for everyone along the French front lines had been catastrophic. The Spanish were useless, and now things were going to the deeps with Austria.
The things I do for extra credit. Well, I think the points we spent working on the Czechs and the Slovenes are paying off handsomely,
Letzi said confidently, though the look around the table wasn't encouraging.
At least something is, Pris grimaced, gesturing up at the map. I hate to say it, but I don't think France can last much longer.
She's right. Rotating units up from the south kept the Germans out of Paris, Cephir sighed gloomily. But morale was shot with the units we rotated back south. We hope they'd recover, but with Spain and Italy attacking, unless we catch a break, I think our whole army will mutiny soon.
They can't keep it up. They've lost all their colonies, now they have to fight in every direction at once.
Letzi shook her head and tried sounding confident, though it was dimmed.
They can't do it. No one could. She's right, and England is mobilized now.
Malondi studied the map carefully.
Japan is all over the Ottomans in the south. Russia is, well, holding their own.
I'm doing the best I can,
Nesta huffed, crossing her arms.
Though, yeah, the Ottomans are turning around and sending troops back south.
That's right,
Malondi said brightly.
Besides, now we have Belda on our side.
The girls looked over at Belda, who was staring off into space in a world of her own.
Look, let's call it a day. Belle has to go get dressed.
Mel grinned as Belda looked up, utterly lost.
She's got a big evening.
Lieutenant, you aren't going to believe this. Lieutenant Beheli Tala looked over from the control board warily to where Sergeant Diani was sitting in the right seat at observation. The bunker pods were all jumbled up with Captain Tonis and Sergeant Jelk out on their trip, leaving Tala to fill in. It was a nice change of pace from running checks in the service corridors and updating the gear in the bunker. Diani had been running the boars while telling long war stories to Sergeant Vaco, who was busy running the odds on that morning's war game, while monitoring the girls' strategy sessions. Words like that out of nowhere were not what she'd wanted to hear. Diani and Vaco had been keeping up a constant stream of conversation, both talking and only mostly listening to the other. It was enough to make her miss the quiet of the tunnels, and she started to tune out the idle chatter. Diani's words snapped her back to reality in an instant, her heart pounding. "Report, Sergeant!" Tala snapped the words out, but she was already pulling up the campus map on the main board, checking frantically for any sit-reps from the ground team. No alarms had gone off yet, but it was probably only seconds away. "Where's the alarm? Why hasn't anyone punched the alarm? I'll have to call Agent Davari and—" "It's Captain Tonis and Jelk." Diani had a cheesy grin plastered over her wide features. "They need us to make some calls and get him a hotel room. You aren't going to believe where." Tala could feel her heart thudding in her chest. No alarms had gone off. There was no intrusion along the perimeter. A what? The Imperial Ocean Reserve was everything that Tom could have hoped for. It was old by Shulvanti standards, but that didn't mean tired. It meant historic, and walking into the lobby conjured up images only found in history books. The reserve was a place where parasols graced the lawns in summer, and moonlight walks on the open beach were the norm. On Earth, it was the sort of place you could envision steamer trunks and top hats. There were 3 restaurants along the veranda, and a bar, shops, and sumptuous indoor pool that served guests all year long. The hotel was vast, not in the sense of catering to all comers, but spacious. It occupied its grounds like a crowning jewel. As for their room, it had a luxurious bed he could get lost in, more than capable of sleeping 6 Shulvanti. While he usually wasn't big on the details, even he noticed the richly embroidered linens, what seemed like down pillows, the plush towels in the marble bathroom, well-stocked bar, and an in-room omnipad to call for room service and requests. That the whole suite lay beneath the ocean, with a glass roof and walls looking out from their bedroom at the surrounding coral reef, didn't hurt either. It was quite a place, but as the girls got started with the unpacking, he slipped out. It had always been his habit to poke around, and finding the best place for dinner reservations seemed like a good idea. A few minutes scatting out the restaurants would save time later. At least, that had been the idea. The veranda surrounding the hotel proper had a lovely view directly off the beach, and as anyone would expect, it drew admiring guests. One of which happened to be Lady Vond, the Duchess of House Jolaire. Tom hadn't seen the woman since preterm, when she'd attached herself to him in the tour, insistently tried to get him to come for a visit, and pinched his ass while showing her daughter around the campus. She'd been noteworthy in managing to do it more discreetly than most, but still. Just at the moment, Lady Vond was in a shouting match against someone named Duchess Pianfar, who swarmed down on him only a minute before Vond. Pianfar had started in on him with her retinue, breathlessly cooing about how charmed she was to meet him, and wanting to hear all the details about human marriages. And of course, she'd seen the captivating video on the news. It was just so rustic, positively enthralling, going native like that. But Vond spotted him and wasn't having any of it, loudly insisting that he'd agreed to visit. And did Pianfar know who she was? Then her retinue started pushing Vond's retinue, while a crowd started to gather around the scene. Tom was the only non-shoe in the room, and being 6'2" and pink, it wasn't easy to make himself invisible. He still did his best, though it was more a testament to the crowd of angry retainers around Vond and Pianfar that he got as far as the door of the bar. He kept his eyes behind him on the crowd as he made a break for it, barging first into a glass, followed by a massive pair of breasts. "Oh, jeez." Tom stepped back. "I'm terribly sorry, miss." A meaty hand clamped down on his arm painfully, and Tom looked up into the ruddy face of Tarola Richet, Nesva's co-mother. Dishevelled and stinking of alcohol, Tarola wasn't in good shape. She'd emerged from the bar with her own crowd of hangers-on, including a Shivanti guy hanging on her arm, and while she'd somehow managed to hang on to her glass, the collision had drenched her top in blue grail. Her eyes widened as she looked down at him, and she growled, "You." All right, she isn't in a good mood, though the last time I saw her she'd been unconscious in a pool of her own vomit. Tarola made the mistake of clamping down harder, and Tom cried out in pained surprise, "Hey, get your damn hand off me!" "Oh, you're coming with me." Tarola tugged him closer. Tom's fingers spread, and he jabbed. The strike was clumsy, and he was off balance, but as eye pokes went, it did the job. Tarola let go of him and bellowed, her hand flying to one eye. The skinny guy thrown off her arm shrieked in bantam fury as he was thrown to the ground. Then, things got a little crazy. Sergeant Jelk knew Big Money. She also knew when Big Money was fobbing her off. Thus far, they made it to the lobby and the reservation staff. The request had come down through official channels, but the manager wasn't happy about it. Despite some ever-so-polite words, it seemed another call eventually came through and did the trick. The manager accepted their story and started offering over a room key with only a trace of disdain. Out in the lobby, there was a scream. It was followed a minute later by the sight of Tom Warwick pelting up the hall at a dead run and ducking into one of the gift shops, pursued by several mobs of women caught up in fighting each other as much as chasing after him. "Captain, It was no use. Solani Tonis had already charged and was racing across the lobby in hot pursuit. Glancing down at their meager baggage, she had the presence of mind to snatch the key from the manager's hand before she could take it back. Somewhere up the hall, Solani bellowed. Moments later, a thunderous crash rumbled from somewhere up the hall. It was followed by the sound of delicate things breaking, considerably more shouting, and a soft cloud of plaster dust that gently wafted around the corner. Jelk turned to the wide-eyed receptionist behind the counter and gave him a rakish smile. "So, what time is dinner?"